Good evening, everyone. Good to be with you tonight. It's a wintry one out there, but I'm just thankful to be here and to be able to share with you this subject of anxiety. Thanks to Nathan for his warm welcome. As you may know, I work not too far along the road, just in Templepatrick. I've been a GP there for over 20 years, so I know this neck of the woods pretty well. I live just across in White Abbey. I'm an elder at White Abbey Presbyterian. I'm married to Alison, who has been teaching in Ballyclare High for the last few years as well. So a few connections with Ballyclare, so it's lovely to be with you folk tonight. And yeah, just delighted to be able to speak on this subject of anxiety. It's a subject that maybe unlike other mental health issues, it's a subject that actually in some shape or form, we all have some experience of, haven't we? I mean, I think as I look down, and I don't know most of you, I recognize a few faces, but I don't know most of you. But I do know something about each of you, and I know that each of you have experienced anxiety at some point in your lives, and probably at many points along the road. So tonight, we want to think a little bit about anxiety, what anxiety looks like. We want to maybe think a little bit about some of the medical and psychological approaches that are taken to managing anxiety. And then we want to look at the Bible as well. We want to look at Scripture and kind of explore anxiety through the lens of Scripture and what we can understand about anxiety as we study that, and particularly those verses in Luke chapter 12. And we think about anxiety, we think of fear. The two things are quite closely connected, as would be stress, fear, anxiety. What's the difference maybe between fear and anxiety? I think there's something quite immediate about fear. You know, fear kind of says, I'm in danger. There's something in the moment that strikes fear that I'm facing. Anxiety might be slightly different. It's more of an anticipation. You know, it's a sense of, I think there may be danger ahead. I anticipate a threat, and therefore I feel anxious. So we'll focus on anxiety tonight. And there's that wise sage, Charlie Brown, who's a bit of a worrier himself, if any of you have read any of Charlie's musings. But that's his new philosophy. I only dread one day at a time. That sense of anxiety it's often with us on a kind of daily basis. And he has that dread one day at a time. So anxiety, it's something that's common to all of us, but let's maybe think firstly in kind of broad terms about anxiety. And as I said at the start, we can connect it, or it's a bit like stress. There's an overlap there, and we've got this bell-shaped curve that you've maybe seen before in different contexts. But yeah, along the horizontal axis there, you've got stress and that sort of increasing levels of stress. And then on the vertical axis, you've got performance. And the curve is kind of representing that there is a certain point where when stress isn't high enough, that in a sense, our performance isn't great. That actually, you know, we thrive with a certain level of stress in our systems. So at that very lower level, there's kind of inertia and inactivity and maybe kind of a failure to be productive. And then we can move to the other end of the curve, and where there are very high levels of stress. And we can see then that we reach a point just at the tip of the curve, and then as it starts to plummet down, where our performance again begins to be hindered. So somewhere in the middle, there's that sweet spot where a certain level of stress enables a good level of performance and productivity. But tonight, I think we're going to look more at the right-hand side of that curve, when stress levels increase, when anxiety builds, and it begins to impair our functioning and what we're able to do. We want to shine a light on different patterns of anxiety, different ways that anxiety will emerge. If you can read that, sort of, we'll look at the different patterns, the different ways that we can understand anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, phobias, social phobias, OCD, and post-traumatic stress. And I want to say tonight that I'm not going to be going into all of this in great detail, and I'm very aware that there will be many aspects of anxiety that I won't cover adequately, and I apologize in advance for that. Tonight is maybe just to give us a kind of overview of anxiety and the different ways it emerges. But if I fail to capture maybe your experience of anxiety, I apologize in advance, and pray that what I do say will be used to be of benefit to you. So we'll think maybe first of all about generalized anxiety disorder. And as we explore the different types of anxiety, we'll consider a few kind of imaginary people that I've made up that will help us kind of understand what the experience looks like. And general anxiety disorder, it involves our thinking. It also involves our bodies. It's something that we feel emotionally. It's something that affects how we think, and it impacts us physically as well. You stand up in front of a church full of people like yourselves, and you get a bit of that anxiety, don't you? Just that sense of, Nathan doesn't. He does this enough that he's comfortable in a place like this. Not so much for me. I'm much more comfortable in a room with one or two other people. So just that sense of the physical impact that anxiety can have on you. Let's think for a minute about Barry. Barry is a guy in his 40s, and he has suffered from generalized anxiety for a while now. He's quite a shy guy. He's introvert. He hates going into a room full of people. Going into shops, having to deal with shop assistants is just a bit of a no-no for him. If he does have the courage to plucks up the courage to buy something, if he gets it home and he's not happy with it, rather than taking it back, he'll just dispose of it. So he accumulates articles rather than taking them back. He dreads presentations at work. He started a new job recently, and part of that role is to speak in front of his colleagues. The first time he spoke in front of a colleague, he was so nervous, he could hardly get the words out. The next time he was asked to speak, he phoned in sick that morning. Barry is starting to stress about his job. He's no idea really whether he'll be able to hold on to a job, because the level of anxiety is impacting his ability to perform. And for Barry, having a cup of tea or coffee after church is one of the most scary parts of his week. It's a real kind of crisis moment for him. How will he feel? Will anybody speak to him? And he'll often go in, if he plucks up the courage to go in and stand maybe on the periphery of the hall, hoping maybe that either somebody will speak to him or he'll just not be noticed. Barry feels like he's a bit of a loser, and he looks around and everybody else seems to be sorted except him. So we can see with Barry that there is a kind of avoidance behavior, where he will be reluctant to go back to somewhere where he's experienced anxiety. His thoughts about himself, of being weak, of not being good enough, of being a failure, and he's these increasing feelings of anxiety. And how does Barry experience these feelings? Well, you can see some of those listed there. So in a physical way, he might have a tremor, he might be shaking. He might feel a lot of kind of muscle tension around his shoulders, maybe experiencing tension headaches. He could have chest tightness when the anxiety is beginning to build. He might be irritable. The fuse could be short. He might be restless. The mouth might be dry. Could be sweating. He may run to the toilet. He may even have feelings of unreality. He may feel at times that he's almost detached from what's going on around him. A lot of those feelings are very physical and impactful. So there's a real physiological element to this kind of generalized anxiety. And there's something hormonal going on in that, when the mind perceives a threat, then the body, the hormone system in the body produces adrenaline, which starts pumping around your body. That kicks into gear, adrenaline is released, and that's why the heart thumps. Adrenaline stimulates the heart. We get this racing of the heart, this pounding of the heart. The blood rushes to the brain as the brain needs more oxygen. Our pupils dilate so that things can come into sharper focus. We get more blood going to our arms and legs just to get ready for that kind of flight or fight response that some of you will be aware of. So essentially, that's why each of us feel anxiety, why anxiety is a very physical experience, because of the chemical release that is triggered when our brain starts to sense that there's a threat ahead. The body just getting ready to meet the threat that's lying ahead. 5 to 10% of people will actually suffer from generalized anxiety. An anxiety that becomes chronic, that becomes part of a person's life, even though it may fluctuate at times. It's something that's embedded and something that is part of their experience. Sometimes anxiety is more generalized like this. Other times, anxiety will come in what feels like more of a burst, more in the form of a panic attack. Think about Irene. Anxiety coming at random, unpredictable moments. That's how it impacts her. She may be feeling okay 1 minute, and then the next minute she's got just extreme symptoms. Her heart's racing, her chest feels like there's a huge weight on it. She can hardly get a breath. She's sweating, she's feeling tremulous. And as she feels all that and experiences all that, she might respond in different ways. She might think, I just need to get out of here, wherever she is. She might just be this reflex urge to escape and get out. So for Irene, she's had a moment in the bakery aisle in Tesco's where it's just hit her all of a sudden. She's left a half-filled trolley and she's had to just get out and get some fresh air. It affects her mind as well as her body. So she gets this intense feeling, and then she starts to worry. She worries, what if this happens again? What if this happens in the wrong place or the wrong time? How might I respond? What if I scream out loud in the middle of one of these panic attacks? What if I feel like I'm losing control? What if I pass out? What if I faint or burst into tears? So these feelings affect her body, but it also begins to affect how she thinks as well. And it affects her behavior then too, because she begins to avoid situations where she would be fearful of having a panic attack. So she'll avoid maybe public transport, she'll avoid places where there might be crowds, she'll avoid lifts. And the more she avoids these experiences, actually, the worse the whole thing becomes for her. And actually, the more her fears increase. So we've got the feelings leading to thoughts, leading to behavior. And these panic attacks for Irene and for anyone who experiences them, they're very alarming. They do reach a peak. They last maybe a few minutes, and then they begin to kind of settle and dissipate. But they leave you feeling exhausted, leave you feeling alone at times too, quite isolated in an experience that seems to be just something that you are going through yourself. Although they're very intense, panic attacks don't cause you physical harm. They feel like they will, but they don't. And we do fear them coming back. We do fear them returning. Clinically, to have a panic disorder, you have to have a number of these, several of these attacks in a 4-week and a sort of monthly period of time. So we can all maybe have elements of panic at times, but to have that real panic disorder, there has to be sort of significant panic attacks, maybe 3 or 4 in a 4-month period. Okay, we'll move on. think about Emily for a second. Emily has a specific fear of a specific thing. She has a real phobia, a real fear of blood, and is just fearful of coming anywhere near it or having anything to do with it. And with her fear of blood comes a fear of needles and a phobia of needles as well. Emily has started dating recently. And as the relationship grows, marriage is actually becoming more of a possibility for her. And with the thought of marriage comes the thought of maybe children. And then with the thought of children comes the thought, potential medical intervention, certainly exposure to needles and blood. And Emily can't quite believe it, but this phobia is actually causing her to have second thoughts about this relationship and whether she should actually think about ending it. In this experience of phobia, anxiety is narrowed down to a very specific object. It's a very specific sense of fear about one thing. And we avoid the thing that we're fearful of. So you want to escape, you want to avoid it. And the feelings are very unpleasant that are associated with phobias. But actually the avoidance of that particular fear just makes the whole experience worse. You know, take an example, maybe somebody who has a fear of flying, and they'll maybe travel then by alternative plans and means. And the whole avoidance of the thing that you're fearful of dominates and kind of hinders the experience, just as the avoidance of blood and needles for Emily could potentially impact, you know, huge decisions that she would make about her life. Maybe think just a little bit, lots of different types of phobias here. What about we put you to the test, see if anybody wants to kind of volunteer what they think these phobias might represent. The first one, we've got acrophobia or altophobia. Anyone, any suggestions what that might be a fear of? Heights, very good, very good, yep. Next one, musophobia. Musophobia. Please a wee bit in the first few letters there. Yeah, I'm sure that is a phobia. I'm not a big fan of mushrooms myself. I like it, yes, but it's actually a fear of, and this is something that there will be a number of folk will have a fear of this. Mice, yeah, fear of mice. I'll not ask for hands up on that one, but dentophobia, obvious, I think. Fear of dentists, yeah. Again, I think there'll be a few hands going up for that one. Agoraphobia, that's a term that we're probably familiar with. What's that a fear of? Anybody know? Yeah, fear of crowds, a sense of, yeah, open spaces and the crowds, the people that come with that. And that's actually a very common phobia. And the real fear there is that in that space, there is no immediate route of escape. You know, you're in this big space. There's a crowd of people. There is no easy way of escape, and it's actually one of the most incapacitating phobias that there are. And it's one that's actually most associated with panic attacks. Claustrophobia. Yeah, it's confined spaces, isn't it? Yeah, fear of small spaces. Maybe moving into some slightly more obscure ones. Pogonophobia. You'll be doing well if you get that one. I'm looking at Nathan for this and maybe one or two other men. It's actually a fear of beards, believe it or not. So there we go. Fear of beards. Alacrophobia. Maybe avoid eye contact with the men for this one as well. Alacrophobia, any idea? Huh? It is. You see, this is testing your Latin skills. This is taking you back to sort of secondary school Latin. It's a fear of becoming bald. Okay. Coulrophobia. Coulrophobia. Any thoughts on this one? I'll special prize if you get this one. It's actually a reasonably common phobia, believe it or not. It's fear of clowns. About 1 in 7 people actually have a phobia or a fear of clowns. Okay, next one. This is a tricky one to get your tongue around, which I'll fail miserably. Arachibutyrophobia. Now, this is obscure stuff. Anybody want to hazard a guess if they're Latin scholars in the room tonight? I know where you're coming from. Arachnophobia, very close, isn't it? It's not actually fear of spiders, but I can see where you're thinking there. It's fear of peanut butter getting stuck to the roof of your mouth. So apparently that is a phobia. And I mean, yeah, you laugh, but I like peanut butter, and it gets stuck to the roof of your mouth, and it can leave you sort of gasping a wee bit at times, or a wee bit stressed. So maybe we can see where that comes from. And then, of course, we had to have phobia, which is a fear of getting a phobia. It had to be that one, didn't it? So yeah, lots of examples of phobias, certainly the ones on the left being more common than the ones on the right. So phobias, remember, that's a specific fear about a specific object. There are specific objects that are the focus there. Thinking just maybe more specifically along the terms of social phobia, you've got that same combination where there are fearful thoughts about a specific thing that has a kind of physical and emotional and behavioral response. And essentially, it's a fear of being judged or evaluated or even being seen by others. And it's very common. It's maybe an experience that comes into sharper focus if you're going for a job interview, or if you're public speaking, maybe just on the first date. If you're even down to maybe eating in public, where some people can feel quite phobic about that. Essentially, it's just a fear that others will see us negatively. But it's an extreme fear, because in many ways that's a fear that many of us have, but maybe at a lower level. But it's an extreme fear that others will see us negatively. It's a fear of kind of humiliation in a social or in some kind of performance situation. Just that worry that people will be critical of us. And that's something that none of us would look for, none of us would seek out. But it's an excessive worry that people will be critical. So it's a shyness, if you like, that interferes with the normal functioning of life. So about 1 in 20 people have a very significant social phobia, to the extent where it's maybe causes them to withdraw, to be reluctant to go out, to mix with others. But it's much more common than that, isn't it? At a lower level, I think many of us can experience elements of that at a much milder degree. So there can be many things, thoughts, things that keep it going. What are the things that kind of perpetuate that sort of phobia? Many thoughts, many behaviors that keep it going. What are some of those things, those elements that perpetuate something like social phobia? Well, it is the idea or the thinking that I should always look like I've got it together. Before others, I should always look like I've got it together. That I can never afford to make a mistake in my performance. I have to be perfect before others. So that's a kind of pattern of thinking that can perpetuate the experience of social phobia. Or it could be a belief about myself, that I'm not actually worth knowing, that if somebody really gets to know me, they'll know that I'm not worth knowing. Or maybe a prediction about the future, that if someone gets to know me, they'll realize that I'm not the sort of person they need to know or want to know. So those are some of the thoughts that can perpetuate that type of phobia. And then the safety behaviors. Well, in order to feel more in control, we may do things to enable us to feel more relaxed. We may avoid eye contact, and we may seek to. Do you remember, like Barry, when he went into the church hall for a cup of tea, he kind of avoided making eye contact. He didn't really want to be seen by others. Some people may use alcohol or other forms of drugs to kind of suppress some of the anxiety, to give them more contact or more confidence. And we may kind of avoid saying anything personal about ourselves. We don't want to reveal too much of ourselves in case people realize that this person isn't the sort of person that I want to mix with. So what do? We kind of deflect attention away from ourselves. I'm guilty of that sometimes, where I'll ask somebody more questions and not give them an opportunity to ask questions about me. Just that desire to kind of deflect away rather than be asked ourselves. And then there are other unhelpful ways of thinking. We might call them at the bottom there, anticipations and postmortems. You know, that sense of anticipating, I'm going to make a fool of myself in this situation. So you play it out in your mind even before it's happened. You kind of anticipate how it's going to go. I'm going to make a fool of myself going into this situation, and therefore I'm just not going to do it. I'm going to avoid it. Or what about the postmortem afterwards? You come away and you think, oh, I wish I hadn't done that, or I wish I hadn't said that. Why did I have that conversation in that sense? Or why did I touch on that subject? So that leads to more self-criticism. It leads to less confidence in these situations. And so that whole experience of social anxiety, it's a very common experience when we see it in those terms. You know, how many people here have had those kind of anticipatory thoughts when you've anticipated going to something, maybe to the point where you thought, I'm actually just not going to go. Or how many of you have done that kind of post-mortem in your head about that conversation that you just wish, the thing that you wish you hadn't said? Okay. We'll move on just to the last two kind of expressions of anxiety. Obsessive compulsive disorder. We'll think of Simon. Simon is a doctor, actually, and Simon has been preoccupied by worries about his children, and a fear that one of his children will develop an illness, particularly a form of cancer. So any mention in the house of a cough or one of the kids having a pain or any kind of lump or swelling, and he goes into this kind of anxious meltdown. And so what does he do? He becomes kind of hypervigilant. He's kind of always wanting to look and to ask and to check when he's with his kids. And if somebody does mention a symptom and he tries not to ask too much, then later on he'll ask his wife for some reassurance. He'll say, they mentioned that, but I don't think that's really anything to worry about. Do you? And so he'll kind of seek out this reassurance from his wife. Do you think they're okay? Do you think I need to be doing anything more about that? And he's actually really tortured by these thoughts, by these worries, so much so that it gets to the point where he avoids conversations or any kind of meaningful interaction with his kids in case they'll mention a symptom or something that will just kind of send them into this sort of free fall of anxiety. And I suppose to add to it, for Simon as a Christian, he feels like he's a bit of a failure. He feels that all this kind of doubting and checking just seems like a kind of massive lack of faith for him. And he's worried about how his children will see him as the Christian dad in the home. So OCD, that's another kind of fear-based condition. Obsessions, obsessional compulsive disorder. The obsessions really are these unwanted, intrusive, repetitive thoughts, or maybe doubts or images or urges that we get. And often the themes might be along the lines of some sense of harm maybe coming at us from contamination or illness, or maybe mistakes we've made. They may even be along the lines of blasphemous thoughts. But they bring anxiety because they represent often the very thing that we simply most do not want. Sometimes, I've spoken to people with OCD, Christians, and at times they'll have intrusive thoughts that actually make them want to maybe curse God, and it abhors them, and it disturbs them. And actually, that's because they represent the very thing that they hate, that they hate most. So to cope with those obsessional thoughts, they engage then in compulsions, behaviors that they use to take away the anxiety from the obsession. So you have an obsession with cleanliness, a fear of contamination, and so you're compelled. The compulsion is that you obsessively hand wash to prevent any further contamination. But the compulsion could be many different things. It could be checking, it could be counting, it could be cleaning, it could be repeating things. There's all sorts of ways that we might be compelled to manage the obsessional thoughts. Simon knows that his fear is irrational, but it's the only way that he can deal, he feels, with these obsessions. The kind of extreme form of OCD, it probably affects about 1 in 50 people. But if you include sort of different degrees of intrusive thoughts, it's actually much more common than that. And so OCD is thought to often have its onset right back in childhood. And it's often linked with experiences of depression as well. And finally then, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. We can talk about Kate. Kate, a couple of years ago, was involved in a road traffic collision, and was actually a multiple car pileup on the motorway. It was a horrific experience for Kate. She actually witnessed 2 fatalities as a result of the accident, even though she was okay herself. And since that experience, Kate, well, first of all, she hasn't been able to drive on the motorway for the last couple of years. And she experiences quite a lot of trauma since that event, a lot of flashbacks, a lot of sleeplessness. So for PTSD, there is something where we have been exposed in the past, maybe the recent past or the very distant past, to an event that was probably life-threatening at the time. So it's mainly linked to traumas which we experience in life, life-threatening traumas. Maybe a car crash, as I say. You might be the victim of an assault, maybe the victim of abuse, the victim of bullying. The sort of classical picture of maybe someone who has worked in the military, but it reaches much further than that, and may well reach into this room tonight. It's an overwhelming experience. You experience these flashbacks, these nightmares. It's a very physical experience. It affects us physiologically, and we often tend to relive the experience and become hypervigilant and alert as we experience the world around us. So that's a kind of overview of some of maybe the main patterns of anxiety that emerge. And if you kind of just cast your mind over those, the generalized anxiety disorder, the social anxiety, the phobias, the trauma, the OCD, and they do involve fear primarily, don't they? But they remind us that actually life is just full of events that are unpredictable, that can maybe seem chaotic in many ways. They remind us that there's so much in life that is beyond our control, and allows us into things that we perceive as threats and dangers. So that's a thread that kind of runs through all of those patterns of anxiety. So essentially, what does it do? Well, anxiety shines a light on what I fear about the world that's around me. So it shines this light on me and the things that I fear about what's going on in the world around me. Maybe the people I mix with, the things that I value, what maybe I fear losing. And anxiety is saying something actually about my heart. It's saying something about my soul in that experience. Now, I'll leave that kind of hanging there for a few minutes, and we'll come back to explore that shortly. So we'll return to that in a few minutes. But let's just think of some treatments that are kind of widely used for anxiety at the minute. There are lots of talking treatments out there, and lots of these treatments have don't have their roots in Christian faith, but I think they're used by the Lord's common grace to help people, and there are ways that a number of these talking treatments can be helpful. So you've got just kind of simple self-help to manage perhaps lower level of anxiety. Just that sense where we can control our breathing when we experience anxiety, just being able to kind of breathe in with our mouth or breathe in with our nose and breathe out with our mouth. And you've got that kind of progressive muscle relaxation as well, sort of techniques where we can just let our body kind of gradually relax. And a lot of that sort of physical emphasis can begin to impact how we think and how we feel in those moments. And where there's social anxiety, the second point, actually social skills training can be very helpful as well. Some of this is particularly helpful for maybe people who are on the autistic spectrum, and anxiety is much more common in young people and adults who are on the autistic spectrum. So teaching social skills kind of seems sort of basic and intuitive, but can be really helpful for some people in their experience of anxiety. How do you start a conversation? How do you focus on the other person when you're having a conversation rather than focusing on yourself? Practicing kind of role play can help to establish better patterns of communication. Because in certain situations, we can feel anxious, but the person that we're talking to has no idea that we are actually feeling anxious. They're oblivious to that. They're probably more worried about how they're coming across to you, even though you are very worried about how you're coming across to them. So in those kind of social skills, you're beginning to expose the person to a threatening situation, partly through role play and then partly through kind of encouraging them to have those conversations and then to explore how they get on. Then we move on to that then to graded self-exposure, which is a kind of one step at a time approach. So you think of situations you find frightening, whether it's maybe a social situation or it could be maybe a phobia. And the idea is that you expose yourself to the thing that you find threatening. And that's a process that's called habituation. And then the more you expose yourself to that fear, to that stimulus, the more the anxiety begins to settle. It's a kind of process of desensitization, you might call it. The more you expose yourself to the thing you fear, the less fearful you become. So you kind of create a hierarchy, as it were. So imagine, some of you may have a fear of spiders. So how might you tackle that through kind of graded self-exposure? Well, you might begin, if you were thinking of the rungs of a ladder, the bottom of the ladder might be just kind of picking up and holding a picture of a spider. And that might be a significant step for somebody who has a significant spider arachnophobia. But as you move up the ladder, then you create steps that gradually expose yourself increasingly to the spider, to the point where perhaps at the end of the process, you're actually able to pick up a spider and hold it for yourself. I think most of us are probably somewhere between the bottom and the top of the ladder. I don't think a lot of us are quite at the top there. So that's graded self-exposure. That's actually quite a big component of the next step, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. A number of you may have heard of that treatment. And again, that's taking a kind of graded self-exposure approach, but it's addressing the cognition. It's addressing how we think. It's addressing that's the cognitive part of CBT. So it's kind of helping the person deal with unhelpful thoughts. It's dealing with some of those rules that we talked about earlier on, with some of the social anxiety. Remember the rules like how we can anticipate or how we can do postmortems. So it helps people kind of explore some of those unhelpful ways of thinking. So it might, for instance, a CBT might look at specific ways of dealing with a panic attack. And that might be something simple like breathing into a paper bag. I always just think it had to be a brown paper bag, but it's actually just a paper bag. It doesn't need to be a brown paper bag. But that is just a very physiological way of rebalancing gases in our body as we hyperventilate in the middle of a panic attack. And breathing through that paper bag helps to rebalance. So it just helps to slow down, to control the breathing, and it's helpful when panic sets in. So it tells us, as you think through CBT and a panic attack, it helps you to sort of say, look, this is not a heart attack that you're having. This feels threatening. It will last a short time, and it will pass. So that's a sort of CBT approach to anxiety. There are also physical treatments that I want to think about just briefly. There are anti-anxiety medications. You've heard maybe of benzodiazepines, the sort of azepams like diazepam, lorazepam, which they are in many ways effective at treating anxiety in the short term. But in many ways, certainly as a GP, I'm reluctant to prescribe it because it's very addictive. So a lot of care and caution has to be taken in the prescribing of medication like diazepam, and we'd be reluctant to prescribe it because it has an addictive nature. Other medications, beta blockers, can be very helpful in managing the physical symptoms of anxiety. Beta blockers just kind of help to do the opposite of what we talked about. Rather than heart racing, they help to slow your heart down a little bit. They help to sort of relax your body and slow your system down. So that there can be benefit in taking beta blockers. Antidepressants would be another mainstay of medical medication in managing anxiety. But generally with anxiety, there's less focus on medication and more on talking therapies. So that's a sort of an overview of what anxiety looks like, and some of the treatments that are used out there, that some of those terms you'll be familiar with, and just to kind of give you a brief understanding of what they're about. But as we said earlier, fear and anxiety, essentially it's revealing something about our hearts. It's something that I find important, something you might say that I find worthy, something even that maybe I might worship. Fear and anxiety begins to shine a light on those things. And it might shine a light on things that I don't want. I don't want danger in my life. I don't want embarrassment in my life. I don't want financial insecurity. I don't want the loss of a relationship. I don't want the loss of health. I don't want people to think badly of me. And if you turn those things around, then they begin to help us show that actually what we do value, the things that are important to us. So anxiety actually begins to shine a light on some of our vulnerabilities. Life is dangerous. Life can be dangerous out there. We can lose the things that we value. We've already said life is unpredictable, and death is going to come. And so anxiety begins to shine a light on how I interpret my future, how I cope with my future, how I deal with it, what I believe, and who I trust. So, as we begin to engage with anxiety, we begin to engage then as people who know the Lord, and we begin to explore sort of with the Lord that there are 4 perspectives that we can consider on anxiety, and 4 perspectives that we can tease out of those verses in Luke chapter 12. So anxiety, as I said, yeah, the first perspective is that anxiety sharpens our focus on life. The context, I think, is important for these verses in Luke chapter 12, because earlier in the chapter, Jesus is actually teaching about the perils of wealth. Verse 13, someone asks Jesus to tell his brother to divide the inheritance between them. And Jesus is really saying in the early part of that chapter, he's saying, be on your guard against greed. He talks he tells the rich fool story, kind of warning people against this preoccupation with material things. And then in verse 22, he says, do not worry about life or your body, what you will wear. He's talking about the essential things of life there, isn't he? He's not talking about, the Caribbean holiday or the luxury car, or, he's talking just about the bare essentials of life there, what we will eat and what we will wear. And in a kind of cost of living crisis that we're living in these days, these verses are very relevant. And Jesus is saying here, actually, that if our attitude to life is just about getting through, if our attitude to life is just about keeping it going, making sure that we have the essentials, then we've got it wrong. If that's all we're worrying about, then we've got it wrong. Because what does he say? He says, life is more than food and clothes. We know that as Christians, I don't need to tell you that life is about living for the Lord. But if that perspective begins to slide out of our way of operating, then anxiety begins to slip in. What we want, I think Jesus is saying here, and what we desire determines how we feel. So what we want, what we desire, what's important to us, determines how we feel. So look at some of the desires, maybe some of the desires that we've teased out already tonight. So if I desire something like comfort or ease in life, then when people put demands on me, I'll become anxious. I'll become nervous. So if life for me is about easy street and comfort or ease, then I will become anxious when people put demands on me. If my desire is to be liked by people, and we've mentioned that already, then if I get drawn into conflict or disagreement, then again, anxiety will develop. The very thing that I hate most is conflict, because the very thing that I want most is to be liked. And so when I'm drawn into a situation of conflict, then the anxiety will come. If I desire order and control in life, then I'll become anxious when things get out of control. That makes kind of perfect sense, doesn't it? If my desire is for success in life, then if I'm brought into any situation where failure is a possible outcome, whether that be a job application or maybe even just something as simple as preparing a meal for some guests, any situation where fear is possible and where success is something that I hold very important, then anxiety will follow. You see, these desires can become the seeds to the patterns of anxiety that we've already looked at. Seeds to social phobia, if I have a ruling desire to be liked. Seeds perhaps to obsessional thoughts and compulsions, because often there a needing to be controlled or to be in control, or a needing to be certain about life is key. And those are actually attributes that I'm wanting in that moment to take from the Lord himself, isn't it? Who's ultimately the only one who's in control? It's the Lord. Who's the only one who is certain about tomorrow? It's the Lord. So essentially, I'm wanting to take attributes that are his and make them mine. So these are matters of the heart, and these desires are deep rooted, and they express how we are made. We are made as image bearers of the living God. We are made to worship, aren't we? We are made to desire the Lord. But as fallen people, our desires are disordered. And so, yes, we want to live for the Lord, and that is our heart's desire. But functionally, on a daily basis, there are other things that capture our hearts. And that is why anxiety feels so strong. And that's why sometimes we can take a verse from scripture that maybe says, do not worry. And we can struggle with it because these desires for other things can be so great. So we take these matters of the heart, we might call them, those desires, and we combine them with other issues, maybe like our current circumstances, the things that are coming at us. But there may be other issues in anxiety. There could be maybe a family history, maybe the genes that we've inherited, maybe how we're wired, our personalities. And you know what I mean when I say that, don't you? That some of us are more wired genetically for anxiety than others. As a parent, you could raise two children exactly the same way. And one child will walk into the school playground and they'll not look back at you. The other child might need to be kind of prized off your leg at the start of school each day in a high state of distress. And I share that story from personal experience of two of my kids. So the Bible, I think, is clear that these patterns of anxiety have their roots in these disordered desires. When I panic, it's maybe because I need a sense of control, or in social anxiety, it's because I've a desire that I want to be liked. And I think even personally for me, as a father of a child, one of our kids has learning difficulties, and certainly Jane's 19 now, but in her earlier life, I experienced quite a lot of anxiety, partly for her and just coming to terms with her diagnosis. But I think, for me, that the Lord has helped me to understand my heart in that anxiety. That in the early days, in Jane's younger days, a lot of the anxiety for me was actually a concern about, the plans that I had for my life, the control that I wanted over life that was suddenly impacted by Jane, who was not, who didn't come according to the plan that I had made for my life, maybe the demands that she has on my desire for comfort at the end of a busy day. Or maybe even my desire for success, my desire to be seen as the kind of successful dad or the successful parent. But for me, I can see how the Lord has kind of progressively, slowly over many years, how he has kind of sanctified some of that anxiety, that it's more now anxiety for Jane and just concern for her, and it's become less about me. So I can see even in my own experience how some of those desires have mapped out into my experience as a dad, and how as the Lord has shown me my heart in that experience and some of those disordered desires, I've been able to bring them to him in confession, and I experience the truth of who he is as the one who is in control, as the one that allows me to be weak so that I can experience strength in him. So we can be alert through anxiety to the things that dominate our hearts. Moving, I've realized that time's marching on here, so we'll move through the last few points quickly. I think anxiety as well sharpens our focus on the Lord. Verse 24, consider the ravens, they do not sow or reap, they have no storeroom or barns, yet God feeds them, and how much more valuable you are than birds. Ravens, they're scavengers, aren't they? They're not particularly splendid birds. They're kind of grubby scavengers. And it's that sort of argument from Christ, how much more, look at creation, and how much more does he care for you? And then there's that second argument at verse 27, consider how the wildflowers grow. They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendor is dressed like one of these. So just that picture of beauty. We've all got our favorite times of the year when we just enjoy the beauty of flowers blossoming in the garden. And Jesus says that if God makes flowers and trees as stunning as this, how much more will he clothe you? Because often when we worry, we behave like we're orphans, don't we? We behave like as though maybe heaven is empty, that there isn't actually any loving Father who cares for us, as if we're on our own. And worry can feel quite isolating. And as parents, we can see how children really get very intensely anxious at times as well, and then how profoundly calm they become. So if you're a parent to a young child, you know what it's like to just, your child wakes up in the night seemingly settled, and they wake up just in a state, and you swoop in and you put your arms around them and you settle them. They go from 0 to 100 very quickly, don't they, kids? And then they can go from 100 back to 0 very quickly as well. And you feel just like that, that marvelous dad or mum or whoever. So when Jesus says, don't worry, I think he's not saying it as a command. It's more that picture of the Father swooping down, swooping us into his arms, and he's saying, settle, my child. He's saying, I'm here. I have you. You don't need to worry. Don't you understand that I love you? It's okay. It's not that sort of command, do not worry, the same way he commands us not to steal. It's more of that picture of a father to the child saying, do not worry. I am with you. So it's less of a command. He's talking to us as though more like we're frightened children, and he's offering us comfort because the Father loves and cares about us. So what are you facing just now yourself? God knows that you're up against it. He's real about what is threatening you, and he's real about the promise that he is with you. And the Lord, I think, is saying in these verses that he's more than just present, but he's by your side, isn't he? That's who the Lord is. The danger itself is actually not the threat, but the actual danger is believing or trusting that our God is failing to trust our God in the threat. That's the real danger. So the danger is not the threat itself, but it's failing to trust God in that threat. That's what we should really fear. So it sharpens our focus on the Lord as the Father who loves us and cares for us. And it sharpens then, thirdly, our focus on ourselves. We move from the ravens to the flowers, but we missed out verses 25 and 26. Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? And I kind of love this from Jesus. He's kind of, in a sense, bigged us up by telling us how much more important we are than flowers or birds. And then he kind of brings us back down to size by reminding us of what we can't do, doesn't he? We can't add a single hour to our lives. He's kind of saying almost, who do you think you are if you think that you can add a single minute or hour to your life? If you can't do that, then really, why are you worrying about anything else? Because when you begin to think about how capable you are, then it gets scary at times, because we can tend in our anxiety to overreach. It's about getting yourself in proportion, realizing what you can do and what you can't do. That's what Jesus is saying. You don't even know what's going to happen tonight. You don't know how long I'm going to talk for. I think maybe some of you are worrying about that if he doesn't stop soon. But none of us know what's going to happen in the next 5, 10, 15 minutes, because we're not in control. Only the Lord is. And I think that's what Jesus is saying. Nothing in the future is known to us. Not really. And when we imagine that we're in control, then actually we're overreaching. We're going beyond our capability. And we get ourselves into all sorts of anxiety when we think we have a reach that is actually beyond us. The Lord reminds us that he is God and we are not. And that's a really humbling thing. And I think that's something that we need to remember in our anxiety. 1 Peter 5, verse 6 and 7 says, humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. We tend to focus on the cast all your anxiety on him, but we forget that preceding verse that calls us to humble ourselves before him. That's only that place of humility knowing our limits, knowing our reach, that enables us to cast our anxiety and care on the one whose arms reach over everything, whose arms are sovereign in his care, who's all-knowing, who's in control of everything. So it's that humbling, knowing ourselves, sharpening our focus on ourselves, what we can do and what we can't do. And finally, anxiety sharpens our focus on the kingdom. Verse 32, do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Jesus is ending this section of teaching by kind of returning back to where he began. He's reminding us about our right desires again, back to these desires that we talked about. The questions we ask are, where is our treasure and where is our heart? What are we pursuing? Think of the parable of the man who sold everything he had to gain the treasure in the field. And as a Christian, you know what is supposed to be most important to you. We've talked about that, our pursuit of the Lord and his kingdom, and what ought to be our highest priority. But I think Jesus is saying, if someone was to watch you, how even today you've spent your time and your energy, what would they see? What treasure has it been that has kind of dominated your waking hours today? And I know for me, that's a scary question. That's a pretty sobering question to ask. But maybe in a sense, that's the point. It's a worrying question because some things are actually worth worrying about. Some things are actually worth being anxious about. Jesus says that seeking his kingdom is something worth worrying about. And then all these things will be added to us. So real peace is found in the pursuit of his kingdom. And even in a sense, that's not quite right, because you notice the language in verse 32. It says, do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Jesus said, it's done. The Father has given you the kingdom. So this is a gift of grace. This kingdom is something that you have already received, and that becomes then the driver for your Christian life. Our seeking the kingdom is not to gain the kingdom in many ways. It's only ever as response to what God has given us already. The blessing that we often spend our lives trying to achieve or earn is the blessing that has already been given to us in Christ. And that, I think, will speak to our anxious minds. So, yeah, just to conclude, those are the four kind of perspectives that I kind of want to draw out of that passage. That begins to speak into those desires that we've unpacked, that map onto some of the different patterns of anxiety. If we had more time, we could look at all the different individuals that I talked about and explore how that truth might impact their experience. But just as I close, the most important thing I want to say tonight is that I hope you don't think that I think this is easy. This kind of dealing with anxiety, it's not easy. I'm not saying just believe this and your anxiety will be sorted. I don't believe at all that it's easy, because we all differ. In actual fact, some people don't actually care enough. Some people don't worry enough. They've almost like an inadequate level of anxiety, because as we've seen, there's a level of anxiety that sharpens our focus on our hearts and the places where God can bring change. So some people are too unaffected by stuff going on. But if you're one of those people who struggle with anxiety, I'm not saying it's easy, but it is good to think about these things, and it can lead us to that precious treasure. And that's what, as someone who is involved in biblical counseling, that's I think what this counseling is about. It's about drilling these truths down into our hearts. And we want to get better at taking truths, not just to kind of recite them at a sort of superficial level, but allowing these truths to penetrate our hearts And part of that is knowing our hearts, knowing the things that we live for, the things that we desire, and allowing truth to reach those places and to be, by the Spirit's help, to begin to transform us. So, well, I pray maybe just now, and then if anybody does have any questions, we can answer them.